No one in Nanjing slept the night the palace fell, not the soldiers on the walls, not the starving families in the alleys, not the royal guards who listened to the sound of drums echoing through the ruined capital like a heartbeat that was about to stop forever. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, once the most shocking rebellion in human history, had shrunk to a wounded city of broken gates, empty granaries, and bodies buried beneath collapsed roofs. For more than a decade, the Taipings had shaken China to its core, claiming visions of heaven, promising salvation, promising a new world where the weak would be fed and the powerful would fall. Now, the Qing armies tightened their grip around Nanjing like a fist closing on a dying flame, waiting for the final moment when the walls would crack and the rebellion's dream would vanish into smoke. Inside the palace, Hong Xiuquan, the rebel king who once claimed to be the younger brother of Jesus, lay sick, delusional, and dying, whispering prayers that even his generals no longer believed. The palace corridors were silent, except for footsteps of desperate officials carrying messages no one wanted to read, and distant cannon fire that grew louder every hour. The Taiping soldiers knew the end was coming, but they fought anyway, gripping rusting spears and chipped sabers, holding to the hope that a miracle might descend from heaven one last time. But heaven had stopped answering, and the empire that promised salvation now waited for its final breath, listening to the sound of enemy drums approaching through the night. The Taiping Civil War had begun almost like a fever dream, a failing student. Hong Xiuquan, collapsing after days of exhaustion, seeing visions of a golden kingdom, angels in white robes, and a radiant figure calling him brother. In his visions, Hong believed he was chosen to cleanse China, to overthrow the Qing dynasty, to purify the world with heavenly fire and establish a kingdom where all wealth was shared and all corruption destroyed. When he woke, he was no longer the man he had been. He was a prophet, a revolutionary, a messiah to millions who lived in hunger, debt, and despair under a collapsing Qing state. Floods ruined farms, taxes crushed villages, bandits roamed the countryside, and imperial officials sold justice to the highest bidder. The people were ready to believe in anyone who offered hope. Hong's teachings spread along rivers and mountain villages, whispered from hut to hut, that the Manchu emperor was a demon, that all men were brothers, that women deserved equality, that a new kingdom was coming for the poor. Villagers flocked to him, sick farmers, desperate mothers, young men who believed the old world had failed them. They formed the God-worshipping society, a movement that blended Christianity, Chinese tradition, and apocalyptic urgency. When the first Taiping armies rose, they grew with terrifying speed, sweeping through southern China like a storm, capturing city after city as Qing commanders underestimated them again and again. By the time the Qing realized the rebellion was real, it was too late. An entire region had fallen, and the rebels were marching toward the ancient capital of Nanjing, claiming heaven was guiding their swords. When the Taipings captured Nanjing in 1853, the city shook with screams, fire, triumph, and horror. Qing soldiers were slaughtered, families dragged from hiding places, and the palace burned as the old order collapsed. The city was renamed Tianjing, the heavenly capital, the throne of Hong Xiuquan's new world. And for a moment it truly seemed like a revolution had crashed through Chinese history with divine fury. The Taipings created radical laws, private property abolished, land divided evenly, men and women separated in all things, opium banned, gambling outlawed, foot binding forbidden, forced marriages destroyed. Women served as soldiers, ministers, and commanders, shocking Qing officials who saw this as the end of all tradition and order. The Taiping armies marched with discipline and religious zeal, carrying banners proclaiming heavenly kingdom, chanting hymns as they fought, believing every battle was a step toward cleansing the world. The Qing dynasty, already weak from corruption, foreign invasions, and internal decay, reeled from the shock, watching half of China slip from its grasp as villagers either fled or joined the heavenly kingdom. For a brief moment, the Taipings stood as a parallel China, a radical, burning, impossible dream born from poverty and prophecy, challenging 3,000 years of imperial history. Had they stopped, consolidated, and built stability, they might have changed the world, but the same fire that lifted them would soon begin to consume them from within. Inside Tianjing, the dream began cracking almost as soon as it began. Hong Xiuquan withdrew into the palace, surrounding himself with heavenly rituals, servants, and visions, drifting further from reality as famine, politics, and war intensified outside. He saw himself not as a king, but as a divine ruler above mortal concerns, leaving the messy complexities of rule to his generals and relatives, who soon began fighting each other for power. The East King, Yang Shuking, who had once been Hong's most powerful lieutenant, began claiming he could speak with the voice of God, challenging Hong's authority and terrifying everyone in the palace. Paranoia spread. Rival kings assassinated each other. Entire families were purged. The Taiping leadership turned inward, killing their own while Qing forces regrouped outside the walls. Corruption crept in, the very evil that Taiping swore to destroy as officers hoarded grain, seized land, and exploited civilians under cover of divine authority. The people of Tianjing suffered under rigid rules, food shortages, and endless fear as political purges shook the capital, destroying unity, discipline, and morale. The heavenly kingdom that promised justice had become a palace of suspicion and silence, its leaders trapped in a web of visions, ambition, and mistrust, while the Qing dynasty prepared its revenge. The Qing response came slowly at first, hampered by decades of weakness, but new leaders rose, men like Zheng Gofan, who believed the dynasty could still be saved with discipline, Confucian virtue, and local militia forces. Zheng built the Hunan army, a regional force trained with strict moral codes, loyalty, and organizational discipline, funded by local elites who feared the Taiping tide more than the Qing court. Unlike the corrupt imperial army, Zheng's forces fought with zeal, believing they defended not just the dynasty but Chinese civilization itself from a dangerous religious upheaval. Meanwhile, foreign powers Britain, France, and the United States, initially confused by the Taiping movement, eventually leaned towards supporting the Qing, fearing instability would disrupt trade. Mercenaries like Frederick Townsend Ward and Charles Gordon trained modernized Qing armies with Western weapons, creating elite units capable of breaking Taiping defenses. The Qing siege grew stronger each year, pushing the rebels back city by city, cutting supply lines, and turning Tianjing into an isolated island surrounded by enemies. Taiping commanders fought bravely, but their unity had shattered, their morale broken, their leadership consumed by visions and purges, leaving armies directionless in the face of relentless pressure. The noose tightened slowly, relentlessly, until Tianjing, once the beating heart of a rebel empire, became a starving fortress waiting for its final blow. By 1863, Tianjing streets were filled with smoke and whispers of doom. Families ate leaves, bark, and rats. Soldiers rationed weapons because they could not replace them, and the once mighty Taiping banners hung in tatters. Hong Shuquan, weakened by illness and delusion, believed manna would descend from heaven. Praying over bowls of scarce food he claimed were gifts from God, while his generals begged him for strategy and leadership. The air inside the palace was heavy with incense, desperation, and the smell of death. Outside, cannon fire shook the walls, each morning like thunder announcing the end of an age. When the Qing breached the outer defenses, fighting spilled through the city, house to house, street to street, courtyard to courtyard, soldiers screaming hymns as they died in alleys filled with flames. Hong Shuquan died before the final assault, some said from illness, others said from eating poisonous wild vegetables, and others whispered he simply chose not to witness the fall. His teenage son briefly became the young king, but the crown he inherited was nothing more than a symbol in a dying city surrounded by the enemy. By July 1864, Qing troops stormed the inner palace, slaughtering the last defenders, executing royal family members, burning the heavenly capital to the ground in a blaze that lit the sky for days. The dream of the Taiping heavenly kingdom ended not with a miracle but with a massacre. When the smoke cleared, the cost was beyond imagination. The Taiping Civil War had killed 20 to 30 million people, making it one of the deadliest conflicts in human history. Entire provinces were depopulated, cities destroyed, farmland abandoned, and rivers clogged with bodies, reshaping China for generations. The Qing dynasty survived, but only barely, weakened so deeply that it would collapse less than 50 years later when new rebellions and foreign invasions struck. Western powers gained stronger influence in China after helping suppress the Taipings, accelerating the era of concessions, spheres of influence, and imperial intervention. The surviving Taiping communities scattered, their faith broken, their leadership dead, their cause remembered with both compassion and fear, a warning about how hope can become fire and fire can become destruction. For China, the war was a wound that never fully healed, a moment when the old world nearly fell and the new world almost emerged. The rebellion had challenged everything: government, tradition, gender roles, religion, and social hierarchy, leaving behind questions that China would continue asking into the 20th century. The night the palace fell was not the end of one kingdom, it was the collapse of one possible future for China. History still debates whether the Taipings truly were revolutionaries, idealists, rebels, heretics, saviors, or simply victims of a world collapsing under its own weight. Some see them as proto-revolutionaries who anticipated themes of equality, shared land, and anti-corruption long before the 20th century. Others see them as fanatics, blinded by visions, and doomed by their own internal chaos. Their story is a mirror reflecting the rage of a dying dynasty, the suffering of millions, and the search for meaning in an age of chaos, famine, and fear. The Taipings expose the weakness of the Qing state, the danger of unchecked religious zeal, and the vulnerability of a society that no longer trusted its rulers. They were both a symptom and a catalyst, rising from the same forces that would later spark the Boxer Rebellion, the 1911 Revolution, and the long arc toward modern China. Their fall did not restore stability. It simply paused a collapse, giving China a moment of breath before the storms returned. The Taiping Civil War was not just a rebellion, it was a civilizational fracture, a spiritual earthquake, a moment when the world nearly split open. And at the center of that storm, on the night the palace fell, lay a story too enormous for textbooks to contain. This is the story of the night the palace fell, a dream that promised heaven but delivered one of history's greatest tragedies. It is a reminder that revolutions are born from suffering, fed by hope, and often destroyed by the very forces they unleash. The Taiping Heavenly Kingdom rose from visions, spread through desperation, and collapsed from within, leaving behind ashes that still whisper warnings about the cost of salvation. The Qing dynasty survived, but the world it ruled had already changed. The seeds of future revolutions had been planted in the burning ruins of Tianjing. The night the palace fell marked the end of one dream and the beginning of another, a long journey toward the birth of modern China, and in the flickering light of that burning city, you can still see the silhouettes of soldiers, prophets, mothers, and children who believed a new world was coming, only to watch it vanish in fire. This is the forgotten heart of the Taiping Civil War, a story too vast for memory, too painful to forget. When the heavenly capital burned, the smoke did not just rise over Nanjing, it drifted across provinces, mountains, and rivers, carrying with it the ashes of a kingdom that had once promised salvation to millions. Villages that had flown Taiping banners now lay abandoned, their people dead or scattered, leaving fields of charred beams and collapsed temples where children once recited hymns. The survivors wandered like ghosts, dazed, starving, clutching fragments of scripture and relics of a dream they no longer understood. Walking across lands so ruined they seemed to belong to another world. Qing soldiers marched through this devastation not as victors but as men horrified by what 10 years of war had done. Entire regions emptied, forests burned, roads erased, rivers polluted with bodies. Every step they took echoed through a countryside that had forgotten the sound of peace. And even the Qing commanders could not deny that the empire they restored no longer resembled the one they had been taught to defend. The Taiping Civil War did not end with triumph. It ended with silence, a silence so deep that even the victorious feared what would come next. Rebellions always leave echoes, and the echo of the Taiping Rebellion was louder than the armies that had crushed it. Ordinary families tried to rebuild what little they could, stacking the bricks of ruined homes, searching rivers for tools, digging through rubble for relatives, and planting seeds in soil still blackened by fire. But famine followed the armies like a second war, spreading across provinces that had once fed millions but now could barely feed a village. Pestilence struck next, as unburied corpses rotted in shallow graves, poisoning wells, barns, granaries, and entire towns that had been left without doctors or elders. The Qing state struggled to respond, its officials exhausted, its coffers drained, its bureaucrats replaced by men too traumatized to govern and too frightened to take risks. Foreign missionaries entered the south, finding a landscape that looked biblical in its destruction: widows praying beside dry wells, orphans scavenging for rice, priests performing mass burials with trembling hands. Some missionaries blamed the Qing, others blamed the Taipings. Most simply wrote that this was the most terrible calamity they had ever seen. China, once the Middle Kingdom that prided itself on order, harmony, and continuity, now felt as fragile as paper. easily torn by the slightest change in the wind. And across this shattered land, a dangerous question resurfaced. If the Taipings had been defeated, what came next? The Qing dynasty attempted to restore normalcy, but restoring order to a burned world proved far more difficult than defeating the rebels. Provincial governors begged the imperial court for grain, soldiers, and money. But the treasury was empty, drained by war, corruption, and foreign indemnities. Local militias, the same groups that had helped defeat the Taipings, refused to disband, creating private armies that answered more to local elites than to the emperor in Beijing. These men, hardened by years of brutal fighting, became warlords in all but name, taxing villages and enforcing their own laws, sometimes more harshly than the rebels they had crushed. The empire had survived the Taipings, but at the cost of empowering regional powers who now held more authority than the imperial court. This shift marked the beginning of a long erosion of Qing central power, a quiet decay that would eventually tear the dynasty apart in the early 20th century. Winning the war had saved the Qing temporarily, but the victory had planted the seeds of their future collapse. The dynasty could not rebuild fast enough to keep pace with a world entering the machine age. And beneath the fragile order lay tensions waiting to rise again. Foreign nations saw opportunity in the ruins and moved quickly to expand their influence. British and French diplomats negotiated new treaties, securing trade privileges, extraterritorial rights, and missionary access that stretched Qing authority to its breaking point. Western gunboats patrolled the Yangtze, sometimes escorting merchants, sometimes forcing compliance, and always reminding local officials that China's sovereignty now depended on foreign restraint. American missionaries built schools, hospitals, and churches in regions once held by the Taipings, trying to fill the spiritual vacuum left by a failed religious revolution. Russian envoys advanced southward, taking advantage of border chaos to seize territories along the Amur, and pushing further into Central Asia. Japan, observing from across the sea, realized that China's internal weaknesses offered lessons and opportunities that would soon reshape East Asia. Every power that saw China in ruins came to the same conclusion. The Middle Kingdom was no longer the central force of Asia. What the Taiping Civil War shattered, foreign empires now began to carve influence and reshape to their advantage. Among the Taiping survivors, the trauma ran deeper than the wounds they carried. Some refused to speak of what they saw, others retold the stories like scripture, insisting that the heavenly kingdom had failed only because of human weakness, not divine intention. Former Taiping soldiers lived in fear, hiding their identities, burying their uniforms, renouncing their past to avoid execution but in secret. They continued to share their memories with children and grandchildren. Some women who had served in Taiping armies returned to villages that no longer accepted them, their military experience both admired and feared, their independence seen as unnatural in a Confucian world. Entire communities that had embraced Taiping teachings tried to return to traditional life, but the old social order no longer fit them. The war had changed how they saw authority, gender, and faith. Christian ideas blended with local traditions, forming underground sects that the Qing struggled to suppress, each one believing the heavenly kingdom would one day rise again. The trauma of the war became part of local identity, a story retold in hushed tones, shaping how southern China remembered the Qing dynasty and viewed future rebellions. Memory itself became a battlefield, and the Taiping dream refused to die entirely. In Beijing, the Qing court celebrated its victory. But beneath the rituals, officials understood that the dynasty had been permanently wounded. The emperor's prestige depended on stability, but the empire was fractured. The bureaucracy depended on discipline, but corruption returned faster than the court could suppress it. Restoring the river systems, rebuilding the granaries, and repopulating the devastated regions required decades the Qing no longer had. Rebellions continued to erupt, smaller than the Taiping but fueled by the same anger, poverty, injustice, and a belief that the dynasty had lost the mandate of heaven. Foreign pressure increased, forcing the Qing to make concessions that further eroded their legitimacy in the eyes of the people. Even loyal subjects began to question whether the dynasty that had relied on foreign armies to save itself could still claim to rule by divine right. The Taiping Civil War had not only killed millions, it had shattered faith in the idea that the Qing deserved to rule at all. A dynasty can survive battles, but it cannot survive the death of belief. And yet, in the decades that followed, The echoes of the Taiping Rebellion continued to ripple outward across China's political landscape. Reformers like Kong Yui, revolutionaries like Sun Yat-sen, and radicals across the late Qing period saw the Taiping as both warning and inspiration, proof that China could break from the past. Ideas of equality, gender reform, land redistribution, and anti-corruption survived long after the Heavenly Kingdom fell, resurfacing in later movements that would challenge the Qing, the Republic, and eventually the nationalists. Sun Yat-sen, the father of modern China, once said that Taipings were proto-revolutionaries, a movement that showed the people's desire for transformation even if it failed. The Taiping Civil War also shaped the Communist Party's understanding of peasant power, mass mobilization, and the risks of uncontrolled ideological zeal. Every political movement in modern Chinese history, reformist, revolutionary, nationalist, or socialist, traced some part of its lineage to the chaos, dreams, and nightmares of the Taiping era. The war was not a dead event. It was a living inheritance, a story that continued to shape China's future long after the smoke cleared. In this sense, the palace did not fall once, it continued falling for a century. Outside of China, the Taiping story echoed across the world as missionaries, diplomats, scholars, and generals debated what it meant for global politics. Some saw it as a religious conflict, others as a social revolution, others as a symptom of imperial mismanagement, and still others as the beginning of China's long struggle to modernize. European newspapers printed lurid accounts of massacres, prophecies, and exotic rituals, feeding Western imaginations with both awe and misunderstanding. American missionaries debated whether Hong Xiuquan was a misguided convert or a blasphemous impostor, shaping early American attitudes about China and Christianity. Military strategists studied the Taiping battles, analyzing how large-scale rebellions could fracture ancient empire, influencing later colonial and counterinsurgency strategies. Economists examined the devastation and warned that instability in China, the world's most populous society, could shock global markets. In an age when the world was beginning to connect through trade and politics, the Taiping Civil War became one of the first truly globalized internal conflicts. Its legacy extended far beyond China's borders, shaping foreign perceptions for generations. In the end, the fall of the Heavenly Kingdom was not simply the end of a rebellion, it was the end of one possible China and the beginning of another. A China where the Qing limped on until they fell in 1911. A China where foreign powers carved concessions from a wounded empire. A China where revolutionaries dreamed of new systems to replace the old. A China where the memory of the Taiping Rebellion lingered in the dust of ruined cities and whispered stories of the millions who followed a vision of heaven made flesh. The Taiping Civil War taught China that faith could become fire, that dreams could become armies, and that desperation could reshape the world. It revealed the danger of a nation collapsing under its own weight, and the power of people who believe they have nothing left to lose. The night the palace fell was not an ending, it was a shadow cast across every rebellion, revolution, and transformation that came after. That night still burns in history, a reminder of the fragile line between salvation and catastrophe, and of the price nations pay when the old world refuses to die.